Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor for the Washington Post. Well, the Post had a revealing story about a very tense battle between Justice Department prosecutors and senior FBI officials about how to get those classified documents from former President Donald Trump's Florida residence. Carol Lenig, an investigative reporter at the Post, was one of the reporters on that story, and she joins me now. Carol, welcome back to First Look.
Glad to be here, Jonathan.
Okay, so conducting a raid on a former president's home was uncharted territory. Your story was vigorous. Your story is about the vigorous internal debate within the department that led to it. But was there a possibility that there could have been no raid conducted at all? What did you and your colleagues find out?
That is such a good question that I haven't been asked yet since the story broke. So kudos to you. Basically, what we learned is there was simmering tension, then a bitter tug of war, and then a absolute knockdown, drag out, shouting argument. A months long dispute about basically should we be treating the president the way we would treat someone else who had classified information, including a senior government official, and seemed to have a ton of it and wasn't cooperating. And then later, who seemed to be concealing it and obstructing a criminal investigation. You asked the question that's so smart. Is it possible there never would have been a raid? Well, that is why we wrote the story, because we were shocked to learn that in June, some FBI agents leading this investigation suggested closing down the investigation. They were talking about how, look, we went to Mar-a-Lago, we served a subpoena on the president, the former president, in May. And in early June, he turned over through his lawyer about 38 classified documents and said, in a signed assertion, his lawyers said, we've turned over everything. The FBI agents were like, okay, nothing to see here, we're done. Prosecutors did not have that level of trust and did not agree at all. In fact, they felt really strongly that more investigation needed to happen. And when they did that, well, you know this story, Jonathan. When investigators and prosecutors said, let's get to it, they found the video surveillance, subpoenaed that surveillance from inside the club, and discovered that people were moving boxes of records out of the storage area after Donald Trump received the subpoena to turn over all that material.
I mean, I'm just gobsmacked. I mean, I know all these things. I read this story, but to hear you say all of these things out loud, it's spectacular that there was even a debate at the start of you answering the question. You laid out all of these, just all of the evidence that they had, and still FBI agents were saying, "Okay, well, we're done." They handed over 38 pages. What I mean, seriously, why was there a debate? Because given what you just said, there shouldn't have been one. Me-
Also a great question, right? Well, we've gotten, as you know, we worked on this for months, and what we learned is that there were two explanations that FBI agents were giving each other, and were giving their bosses, and were giving prosecutors. And the two reasons, neither of them are ones I think you're going to love. But here we go. The first one, provided by senior FBI officials to us, was look, these agents were afraid of Donald Trump, afraid
Mhm.
of what had happened to FBI personnel in previous investigations of him. I mean, let's keep in mind Andrew McCabe, who opened up an investigation into Trump's obstruction in 2017, had his tax returns audited,
Mm.
apparently at the direction of former President Donald Trump. He was fired by Donald Trump days before he reached retirement age and was able to collect his full pension. He had to hire a lawyer to try to recover those pensions and benefits that he was deserving of, and he was successful. But what a trial, essentially, for launching that investigation. Everybody was mindful of what they called the hangover or the lessons of Crossfire Hurricane. Crossfire Hurricane is the code word for the investigation of Russia's interference in the 2017 election and Donald Trump eventually trying to obstruct that investigation. So there's that fear. The second reason, I'll try to say more quickly, is that FBI agents told their colleagues, look, this is a former president. We do not want to be second guessed and scrutinized by an inspector general or Republican members of Congress later that we didn't dot all our I's and cross all our T's. We want to do this exactly right. And there's no reason to be aggressive unnecessarily. Their view was, hey, why do we have to be combative? Let's just try to get these records.
I'm taking notes here, Carol, because this is really incredible. And your first answer that agents were afraid of Donald Trump, and the Andrew McCabe example of having his taxes audited leads to my third question about this. The prosecutors at Justice and the senior FBI officials, they're not supposed to be political. I mean, they are supposed to just follow the law, follow the facts. But did your reporting show any evidence that politics factored into this dispute? And when people hear politics, they're thinking Democrat versus Republican, left versus right. But the fact that the agents were afraid of what Donald Trump could do to them, does that fall under the rubric of politics?
Jonathan, I want to answer this carefully because, our reporting does not go into what the partisan interests are or leanings of FBI agents. You're exactly right. FBI agents and prosecutors throughout my entire career, I have known many of them and revered them, and they put their politics at the door. They have some opinions, but in the service of justice, it's unimportant to them. However, I think we've all seen in the last 5 years that more of people's partisan viewpoints are not being checked at the door. Answering your direct question, I think it's inescapable to conclude that politics is the result of people being afraid of a incredibly high profile standard bearer for the Republican Party being able to target folks in their agency when they're doing their job, being able to target, blemish, and basically end run some of their careers. When people are afraid of that kind of political power and they are making decisions based on it, it's hard not to conclude that that is political. I want to
Uh,
add one more thing. I need to add one
please,
more thing about
yeah,
this.
go ahead.
A really smart editor once said to me while we were working on this story, Peter Walston, he said at the very beginning, is the Justice Department in all its forms, the FBI, the prosecutors, is it capable of being apolitical still and protecting democracy? And that's still a really open question right now based on this reporting, I feel. There was fear, and without fear or favor is how the Justice Department is supposed to operate.
That is an excellent point. Without fear or favor, and Donald Trump hasn't been president since January 20th, 2021, and yet there still appears to be a hangover. Does that hangover seem to go right up to the attorney general? And I'm thinking about this because of the hearing that he sat through with Senate Republicans just raining fire on him, accusing him of all sorts of political actions.
I know Merrick Garland from covering him when he was on the appellate court, the chief of that court, and I feel that his experience as a judge has made him a very thoughtful, rigorous, almost ponderous public official. He is not an operational prosecutor like many previous attorney generals, but it does seem to me that he is somewhat impervious to this rain of attacks. It's annoying to him, no doubt, but I think the way in which that political ammunition causes pain and affects decisions is below Merrick Garland.
Mm.
It's just a couple rungs below him for people who want to, still maybe go to another confirmation battle for another high job, or FBI agents who are very senior who don't want to have their careers blemished or attacked by Republicans and then be in the Google machine forever and be unable to be promoted to a very senior, confirmable job. So I think it can have impacts. I don't think Garland is a person that is taking these slings and arrows and changing his behavior as a result.
And as someone who has not covered Merrick Garland as long as you have, but just watching him since becoming Attorney General, I have to agree with you 100%. The guy just sort of flies at 40,000 feet. They can say whatever they want to say to him, and he's just like that. It drives people crazy, particularly folks who want him to act very quickly on things that they think he should be acting on. But I'm like, let the man take his time, because once he makes a decision, at least I will feel that it is airtight. Carol Leonnig, three-time Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter at the Washington Post. Thanks for coming back to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great question. See you soon.
See you soon. We're going to keep the conversation going with the Opinions Roundtable in just a moment. Let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post columnists Christine Emba and Ramesh Ponnuru. Christine, Ramesh, welcome to First Look.
Thanks for having us.
All right, Christine, what do you make of this tug of war between Justice Department prosecutors and FBI officials about conducting that raid on Mar-a-Lago? And when you answer this, I just wonder, do you think that Carol Leonnig and her colleagues' story lend credence in any way to Trump's assertion that the raid and other investigations are part of a, quote, witch hunt?
Yeah, in fact, I would say that this report lends far more credence to the fact that it wasn't, that the FBI, in fact, almost had to be pushed to investigate Mar-a-Lago and go after Trump. They were extremely careful and were, in fact, looking for any excuse possible not to do it. But it seems that the evidence was overwhelming. I want to tack back to what Carol was saying about sort of the fear around investigating Trump, around retaliation. Um, if anything, I think we should continue to be worried about the influence that Trump and whatever power he has left has in our political system.
Yeah, Ramesh, your thoughts on this story, particularly the tug of war over what to do. Am I wrong in thinking that such a tussle was a good thing?
Yeah, well, I think that some behind the scenes debate, even intense debate about how to proceed in this extraordinary case was inevitable and should have happened. Just as I assume, I have to go back and go through the reporting on the Clinton investigations of 2015 and 2016, but I assume there were similar levels of debate because you've got this very high-profile political figure, and in that sense, everybody I think understands that it's not just a sort of run-of-the-mill case. And then it becomes hard when you're thinking about sort of the public fallout from an investigation like this to insulate yourselves totally from sort of improper political considerations, just like fear of criticism and so on. So none of that is particularly shocking. But what's interesting in this story, I think, is you get the kind of texture of this debate a little bit, and you do get a strong sense from this reporting that there was a kind of foot dragging, and as I think Christine was saying, kind of almost looking for excuses not to act. One thing I would be very interested in seeing is if any of the field agents who were skeptical and resistant to taking action after documents were turned up, and it turned out that the Trump lawyers had not been completely forthcoming about, or at least accurate about what what Mar-a-Lago had, whether any of them had second thoughts and thought, well, I guess we were right to press forward with this.
The one thing that Carol said, among many things that Carol said, was just the fear that the FBI agents had about the retaliation that they could face from Donald Trump, and Andrew McCabe being their sort of the case study of what they didn't want to have happen to him was actually quite chilling. Christine, at the time of this raid, future House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said the Justice Department had reached, quote, an intolerable state of weaponized politicization. And we saw that kind of rhetoric employed during a Wednesday Senate hearing with Attorney General Merrick Garland. So am I to take it that Republicans still believe that kind of rhetoric helps them?
I think you have to believe that because they keep using it. I do think we've also seen the Republicans seem a little bit confused as to what helps them and what does not at this point. I mean, if you think about what they're saying, an intolerable level of weaponization, saying that to Merrick Garland, who had his Supreme Court nomination
Right.
essentially weaponized against him, that man has been through it. I find it kind of shocking that you would even attempt to say something like that about the Justice Department under, his watch. I do think, though, that the Republican Party right now, Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House, and many House members, Marjorie Taylor Greene, etc., are speaking to what they see as the base, a base that still loves Trump, a base that still believes in sort of conspiracy theories about how the government is out to get them. Kevin McCarthy, I think, in particular, having been extraordinarily weakened in his 15 nomination votes for Speaker, is trying to sort of gin up any kind of support that he can get. He'll say anything at this point, and Republicans are willing to say anything at this point. What gives kind of a lie to their assertions is the idea that, the FBI is targeting Donald Trump, who is an innocent man. At the same time, as Carol points out in her piece, once the FBI did begin to investigate, they found Trump officials carting secret documents out of Mar-a-Lago. So he was, in fact, doing crimes.
Well,
Right.
I think
Well, I mean, just moving boxes around, making it clear that they didn't really give over all the documents. And can we just talk about the fact that there was just a story about a month ago about how they found even more documents and a flash drive? They put the- Anyway, Ramesh, your reaction to what Christine said.
sure. So let's going back to the sort of the Republican rhetoric.
Yeah.
I think a lot of Republicans, including now Speaker McCarthy, jumped the gun in the way they responded to the raid in August. And what should have been said, what would have been perfectly appropriate to say was, this is an extraordinary act, and it requires extraordinary justification. And we await, quickly getting a look at that. On the bigger question of sort of the rhetoric about the weaponization and politicization of law enforcement, I think that Republicans believe this in large part, and I think there's some reason to believe in it. Sure, Garland was subjected to political hardball, and we can have different views about how that went. But that's different, I think, from the question of politicized law enforcement. And I think Republicans in particular right now are looking at the kind of harassment of peaceful pro-life protesters coupled with the lack of interest by federal investigators in violence and threats of violence against pro-life organizations and crisis pregnancy centers. And they think, well, that fits pretty well with this administration's priorities. It is part of an administration that really wants to reassure its allies it's got their back. Is this the right use of law enforcement resources? I think that sort of thing is bound to give rise to Republican fears that law enforcement is not being even-handed.
Christine, I'm sorry, Ramesh. There's some reason to believe that the Justice Department has been politicized, and then the example of pro-life organizations.
Firebombing, vandalism, threats. We haven't. There hasn't been any even denunciation from Merrick Garland of these attacks. This widespread and seemingly systematic campaign, and instead we have the case of Mark Huck, who gets sort of gratuitously prosecuted in a case that ends up getting thrown out because it's so weak.
Christine, do you have any response to that?
I would say that my response is actually confusion. I don't at all think that you can put the firebombing of pro-life organizations at the foot of the FBI or the Justice Department, to the
That's not what
extent
I'm
that these
saying, though, of
are
course.
crimes that are
I,
happening.
I, I'm
I
saying,
think that we've seen investigations of those crimes happen from Justice, FBI, and police forces in the area. I don't see how those are related.
Yeah, Ramesh, let's move on because I want to come back to the documents issue because President Biden and former Vice President Mike Pence, they've cooperated with the Justice Department when classified documents were discovered among their respective belongings, and Donald Trump did not, clearly did not. So how differently do you see these cases?
I think Trump's behavior was worse, as far as we know about it. I think that Biden's cooperation is a little bit overstated, and that some of that cooperation was when the jig was up. There were certainly several months that went by between the Biden team learning about the documents it had in its possession and their tipping people off about it, let alone going public with it. But you don't have the pattern of uh, resistance to Justice Department, FBI inquiries, and concealment. So I think that there is a different case. And whether it's a strong enough difference to justify prosecution, which I think at this point would have to be just on the obstruction stuff, not on mishandling of documents. That's, I think, going to be a very tricky question for prosecutors and someday for jurors.
Um, Christine, um, sorry, I'm beyond words here. How differently do you see the cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're extraordinarily different, actually. Ramesh, I think I would agree with you that in terms of sort of mishandling documents or having classified documents about the premises that perhaps the department wasn't informed of, they are similar cases. But when you say that obstruction is the only difference here, I mean, we just have to look at the degree of obstruction that has been perpetuated by the Trump administration, hiding the documents, stalling, trying to prevent investigation from happening, um, creating, discussion of sort of threats and fear within the FBI, and then saying that its own administration, its own safety was being threatened. President Trump trying to whip up public sentiment by repeatedly claiming that he's being persecuted and victimized by the US government. And then, as we just mentioned, the fact that when the FBI finally was able to get access to Mar-a-Lago, they found employees literally moving the documents around and attempting to hide them. Um, the Biden
Yeah,
administration may have been lax in, identifying the documents firsthand, but then promptly handed them over without complaint. These are just two wildly different
yeah,
circumstances in my
yeah.
estimation.
Yeah, it sounds like we're agreeing, though, that it's an obstruction case. It's not a mishandling of documents case.
And well, I mean, it's actually both. Also,
Right.
you left out
What we think the prosecutors are actually
sorry,
going to move
Ramesh, and Christine, you left out in your litany there. He also ignored subpoenas, which is why the search had to happen. Let's move on to the Chicago's mayor's race. Um, Mayor Lori Lightfoot lost her bid for re-election this week, the first time in decades that a mayor has lost re-election, and was badly hurt by rising crime in that city. Brandon Johnson, a Cook County commissioner, will now face Paul Vallis, the former CEO of the Chicago Public Schools, in a runoff in April. Here's part of what Vallis said in his victory speech Tuesday night. Let's listen.
Public safety is the fundamental right of every American. It is a civil right.
Oh, really?
And it is the principal responsibility of government. And we will have a safe Chicago. We will make Chicago the safest city in America.
Well, time flies when you're having fun. We've got less than 2 minutes. So, Christine, how badly was Mayor Lightfoot hurt by the crime issue, and could she have handled it better?
She was very badly hurt, honestly. I think one of the things that Democratic legislators, Democratic mayors, Democratic leaders across the country are being faced by rising levels of crime that peaked during the pandemic and are falling now, but are still higher than their baseline. Could she have done much? She did state that she was against the idea of defunding the police, but she did allow police vacancies to go unfilled in the city of Chicago. That said, mayors don't have that much leverage when it comes to changing crime statistics in their cities. There are economic
Right.
proposals that they could pursue. Those don't have results that show up very quickly. So she was being blamed for something that probably wasn't within her control.
Right. And Ramesh, around a minute left. What should Mayor
Sure.
Lightfoot have done to demonstrate to voters that she, at a minimum, had a handle on crime?
So I think at a certain point, the results are what matters more than the rhetoric or sort of how seriously you're taking an issue. But when you look at the absolute cratering of her support between these elections, you have to assume it's not just she had, bad luck or bad results, but that she didn't have great political skills in handling those kinds of problems. She seems to have alienated a ton of allies, and it sounds like it's the kind of thing. It's like when people would say, "Well, Trump should have done this, Trump should have done that," and he's like, "Yeah, but he'd have to have a completely different personality." Lightfoot, I think, would have had to be a completely different person.
Wow. Well, I had so many questions about so many other topics and we didn't get to them, but we'll have you back and maybe they'll be back in the news at that time. Christine Emba, Ramesh Panuru, thank you both very much for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
You
You
too.
too.
Head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find more information about next week's interviews and to register. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.